Madison panics while organizing an expensive party, desperately trying to hide bank statements showing her financial ruin. She quickly shoves overdue bills and maxed-out credit card statements into a drawer before guests arrive. Madison counts her last few $100s while surrounded by unpaid bills, realizing she's completely broke. Alexander arrives for the party in his expensive suit, while Madison greets him nervously, hiding her financial desperation. 1 year earlier at an elegant charity event, Madison works as a waitress, serving champagne to wealthy guests. Madison accidentally spills red wine on her waitress uniform while serving at the prestigious charity gala. In the bathroom, Madison removes her waitress apron and decides to pretend she's a wealthy guest. Alexander, a handsome businessman in an expensive tuxedo, approaches Madison believing she's one of the wealthy charity guests. Madison charms Alexander by pretending to be from a wealthy family, and he's immediately captivated by her elegance. Alexander asks for Madison's number, completely enchanted by what he believes is her sophisticated background and class. Back in the present, Madison watches Alexander enjoy their expensive party, unaware she's drowning in debt. Madison quickly hides more bills behind her back as Alexander approaches her lovingly during their party. Alexander makes a toast to Madison at their party, praising her for being the perfect woman he always dreamed of. After the party, Madison sits alone, counting her maxed-out credit cards, realizing she can't keep this up much longer. Madison works frantically on her laptop, taking freelance jobs to try to pay for the lifestyle she can't afford. Alexander surprises Madison with an expensive gift, not knowing she's sacrificing everything to maintain her fake wealthy image. Madison stares at herself in the mirror, exhausted from maintaining the lie and working secretly to afford everything. Madison works through the night on freelance projects while Alexander sleeps, unaware of her double life. Madison realizes she's trapped in her own lie, but knows that losing Alexander would destroy her completely. Madison knows that what happened when Alexander discovered her lie would change their lives forever. Madison asks viewers where they're watching from and encourages them to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible stories. Catherine rushes through the hospital corridor after receiving the devastating phone call about her parents' car accident, her heart pounding with fear and disbelief as she navigates through the sterile hallways, hoping against hope that the doctors will tell her it's all been a terrible mistake. The fluorescent lights overhead seem to blur as tears fill her eyes, and she can barely comprehend that just hours ago she was having a normal evening at home with David, completely unaware that her world was about to be shattered by this unthinkable tragedy that would change everything about her life and her family forever. The doctor delivers the heartbreaking news that both of Catherine's parents died instantly in the head-on collision with a drunk driver on the interstate, explaining that there was nothing the paramedics could do given the severity of the impact. Catherine collapses into a chair as the reality hits her that she'll never see her loving parents again, never hear her mother's laugh or receive her father's wise advice during difficult times. The doctor's words seem to echo in a distant tunnel as she struggles to process that the two people who raised her with such love and care are gone forever, leaving her feeling completely alone and lost in a world that suddenly feels cold and meaningless without their presence. During the funeral service, Catherine stands beside her parents' caskets, surrounded by hundreds of friends and family members who came to pay their respects to two people who touched so many lives through their kindness and generosity. David stands supportively beside her, holding her hand as she struggles to maintain her composure while listening to heartfelt eulogies about her parents' successful business empire and their dedication to charitable causes throughout their lives. The overwhelming grief makes it difficult for Catherine to focus on anything except the devastating reality that she's now an orphan at 45 years old, forced to navigate the world without the unconditional love and guidance that had always been her anchor during life's most challenging moments. 1 week after the funeral, Catherine meets with her parents' longtime attorney to discuss the reading of their will, still feeling numb from grief and barely able to concentrate on the legal proceedings. The elderly lawyer expresses his condolences before explaining that her parents had updated their will just 6 months ago to ensure their estate would be properly managed and distributed according to their wishes. Catherine sits quietly in the leather chair, surrounded by law books and legal documents, trying to prepare herself emotionally for whatever final messages her parents might have left for her, never imagining that this meeting would reveal information that would completely transform her financial situation and set in motion a chain of events that would threaten her very life. The lawyer reveals that Catherine's parents built a much larger fortune than she ever realized, leaving her an inheritance worth exactly $15 million from their successful real estate development company and various investment portfolios. Catherine stares at the documents in complete disbelief, having always known her parents were comfortable, but never imagining they had accumulated such an enormous amount of wealth through decades of smart business decisions and careful financial planning. The numbers on the papers seem surreal as she struggles to comprehend that she's now a multimillionaire, inheriting more money than she could spend in several lifetimes, while simultaneously grieving the loss of the two people whose love and wisdom meant more to her than any amount of money ever could. David celebrates the incredible inheritance news with Catherine when she returns home from the lawyer's office, telling her how amazing it is that her parents provided so generously for their future together. He holds her close and expresses how proud he is that she comes from such a successful family, reassuring her that her parents would want them to use this blessing to build a wonderful life together. Catherine feels comforted by his support during such a difficult time, grateful to have someone who understands both her grief over losing her parents and her overwhelming confusion about suddenly becoming wealthy beyond her wildest dreams. Not yet recognizing the subtle change in his demeanor as his mind begins calculating the possibilities that $15 million could provide for his own personal ambitions. Several weeks later, David begins showing more interest in financial matters, reading investment magazines and business newspapers while suggesting that Catherine needs to be smart about managing her substantial inheritance. He starts asking detailed questions about her meetings with financial advisors and expresses concern that she might make decisions too quickly while still grieving her parents' death. Catherine appreciates his involvement and concern, believing that his business background makes him naturally interested in helping her navigate this new financial responsibility, completely unaware that his questions stem from a growing obsession with controlling access to her millions rather than genuine concern for her well-being or financial security. David begins questioning Catherine's financial decisions more frequently, suggesting that she seems overwhelmed by the responsibility of managing $15 million and might benefit from having someone help her make important choices. He points out that grief can cloud judgment and recommends that she avoid making any major financial moves until she's emotionally stronger and thinking more clearly. Catherine starts to doubt her own abilities as David subtly undermines her confidence, making her feel like she's not smart enough or emotionally stable enough to handle such significant financial responsibility, while he positions himself as the logical person to help guide her through these important decisions that will affect their future together. David expresses worry that Catherine appears increasingly stressed and suggests that managing such a large inheritance might be too much pressure for someone still dealing with the trauma of losing both parents. He recommends that she consider letting him handle some of the financial decisions temporarily, just until she feels more emotionally stable and ready to take on such enormous responsibility. Catherine begins to feel uncertain about her own judgment as David continues to emphasize how complicated wealth management can be, making her question whether she's truly capable of making smart decisions about money while simultaneously grieving and adjusting to her new circumstances, not realizing that his apparent concern is actually the beginning of a carefully orchestrated plan to gain control over her entire inheritance. Catherine lies awake at night, feeling increasingly anxious about her ability to properly manage her inheritance, David's words echoing in her mind about being too stressed and emotionally unstable to make good financial decisions. She starts to believe that maybe he's right about needing help, that perhaps the grief has affected her judgment more than she realized, and that having someone she trusts guide her through these important choices might be the responsible thing to do. As David sleeps peacefully beside her, completely unaware of the dark thoughts forming in his mind about how he might gain complete control over her $15 million, Catherine makes the first step toward trusting him with decisions that will ultimately lead to her losing everything she inherited from her beloved parents. David begins his psychological manipulation by subtly moving Catherine's coffee cup from where she always places it on the kitchen counter to a completely different location, then watching her confused reaction when she can't find it in its usual spot. When Catherine asks if he moved her cup, David calmly denies any involvement and suggests that she probably just forgot where she put it due to stress from managing her inheritance. This seemingly innocent incident is actually the first step in his carefully planned campaign to make Catherine question her own memory and judgment, setting the foundation for much more serious manipulation that will eventually convince her that she's losing her mind and needs someone else to make important decisions about her $15 million inheritance. Catherine searches desperately through the living room for her car keys, becoming increasingly frustrated as she checks every possible location where she might have left them the night before. David observes her frantic search with carefully concealed satisfaction, knowing exactly where the keys are because he deliberately moved them to an obscure location behind a decorative vase on the bookshelf. When Catherine finally asks for his help, David suggests that her forgetfulness might be connected to the emotional stress of dealing with her parents' death and managing such a large inheritance, planting seeds of doubt about her mental stability while positioning himself as the concerned husband who's worried about her well-being and ability to handle important responsibilities. While Catherine is upstairs taking a shower, David quietly enters her home office and deliberately rearranges important financial documents that she had carefully organized in specific folders and filing systems. He moves investment statements to different folders, places bank documents in wrong locations, and subtly alters the organization system that Catherine relies on to keep track of her complex inheritance portfolio. This calculated sabotage is designed to make Catherine feel confused and overwhelmed when she tries to locate important paperwork, further supporting his narrative that she's becoming too scattered and unreliable to manage her own financial affairs without professional guidance and support from someone she trusts completely. During dinner, David casually mentions their supposed conversation from the previous evening about hiring a financial advisor, acting surprised when Catherine has no memory of this discussion ever taking place. He describes in detail how she allegedly expressed feeling overwhelmed by her inheritance responsibilities and asked for his advice about finding professional help to manage her money more effectively. When Catherine insists that this conversation never happened, David responds with gentle concern, suggesting that perhaps the stress is affecting her memory more than either of them realized, making her question whether she's losing track of important discussions and decisions that could affect their future together. David calls their mutual friend Mike and puts the phone on speaker, asking him to confirm the dinner conversation they supposedly had last week, where Catherine expressed concern about her memory problems. Mike, who has been coached by David beforehand, enthusiastically confirms this fictional conversation, describing how worried Catherine seemed about forgetting important things and how she asked for recommendations from mental health professionals. Catherine listens in shock as Mike recounts this detailed conversation that she has absolutely no memory of having, making her feel increasingly confused and frightened about what might be wrong with her mind, while David watches her growing distress with carefully hidden satisfaction. During dinner with their friends Janet and Robert, David casually mentions Catherine's recent forgetfulness and memory issues, prompting both friends to nod sympathetically and share their own observations about her seeming confused during recent social gatherings. Janet confirms that Catherine seemed disoriented at their book club meeting last month, while Robert agrees that she appeared to forget his name at their anniversary party. Catherine sits in stunned silence as her trusted friends describe incidents she either doesn't remember or remembers completely differently, feeling increasingly isolated and frightened as the people closest to her seem to confirm that something is seriously wrong with her mental state, not knowing that David has been systematically contacting their friends to plant false stories. Catherine stands at the kitchen sink washing dishes while struggling with overwhelming confusion about her apparent memory problems, feeling frightened and alone as she tries to understand why she can't remember conversations and events that everyone else seems to recall so clearly. David approaches her with gentle concern, wrapping his arms around her and expressing how worried he's become about her mental health, suggesting that perhaps they should consider seeking professional help before her condition gets any worse. Catherine leans into his embrace, grateful for his support, while feeling terrified about what might be happening to her mind, completely unaware that David is the orchestrator of all her confusion, and that his concern is nothing more than calculated manipulation. As they prepare for bed, David gently suggests that Catherine might benefit from talking to a therapist about her memory issues and the stress of managing her inheritance, emphasizing how much he loves her and wants to help her through this difficult time. He mentions that he's heard excellent things about a Dr. Harrison who specializes in helping people deal with grief, stress, and memory problems related to major life changes. Catherine feels touched by his caring suggestion and agrees that maybe professional help would be beneficial, not realizing that David has been planning this moment for weeks and that Dr. Harrison is someone he's already been secretly meeting with to discuss strategies for gaining control over her inheritance. While Catherine tends to her garden outside, David makes a private phone call to Dr. Harrison to update him on Catherine's increasing confusion and vulnerability, discussing the timeline for their plan to have her declared mentally incompetent to manage her own financial affairs. Dr. Harrison confirms that he's prepared to provide the necessary medical documentation to support David's petition for guardianship over Catherine's $15 million inheritance, emphasizing that their coordination must remain completely secret to avoid any legal complications. David watches Catherine through the window as she works peacefully in her garden, completely unaware that her husband is systematically destroying her life and preparing to steal everything her parents left for her through an elaborate scheme involving medical fraud and psychological manipulation. Catherine finally agrees to schedule an appointment with Dr. Harrison after David's gentle persistence about getting professional help for her memory problems and stress management issues. David calls the doctor's office while Catherine listens, speaking warmly about his wife's need for support during this difficult time, while emphasizing how concerned he is about her recent confusion and forgetfulness. As David schedules the appointment for the following week, Catherine feels hopeful that therapy might help her understand what's happening to her mind and provide strategies for managing her overwhelming responsibilities, completely unaware that she's walking directly into a carefully orchestrated trap designed to rob her of her independence, her inheritance, and ultimately her freedom. Catherine sits nervously in Dr. Harrison's waiting room, feeling anxious about her first therapy session, while David holds her hand and offers reassuring words about how this professional help will make everything better. The sterile medical environment with its beige walls and medical certificates makes Catherine feel vulnerable and uncertain, while she hopes that Dr. Harrison will be able to explain what's happening to her memory and provide strategies for managing her overwhelming stress. David maintains his caring husband facade perfectly, expressing how proud he is of Catherine for taking this important step toward getting help, while internally calculating how this appointment will advance his plan to gain legal control over her $15 million inheritance through fraudulent medical diagnosis and manipulation. Dr. Harrison conducts what appears to be a thorough psychological evaluation, asking Catherine detailed questions about her recent experiences with memory problems and the stress of managing her inheritance. Catherine honestly describes her confusion about misplaced objects and forgotten conversations, while Dr. Harrison nods sympathetically and takes extensive notes, asking leading questions that encourage her to elaborate on her feelings of being watched or manipulated. When Catherine mentions her suspicions that someone might be moving her things deliberately, Dr. Harrison's expression becomes concerned as he carefully documents what he will later characterize as paranoid thinking, building the foundation for his predetermined diagnosis that will justify removing her legal right to control her own financial affairs. Dr. Harrison delivers his shocking diagnosis, explaining that Catherine appears to be suffering from paranoid delusions combined with stress-induced psychosis related to her parents' death and the pressure of managing significant wealth. He describes her suspicions about objects being moved and conversations being denied as classic symptoms of paranoid thinking that could escalate into more serious mental health complications without immediate intervention. Catherine feels devastated as Dr. Harrison explains how paranoid delusions can make patients believe that family members are plotting against them, when in reality, their loved ones are trying desperately to help them recognize their need for professional treatment and medication to restore their mental stability and protect them from making dangerous decisions. Dr. Harrison prescribes a powerful combination of antipsychotic medications that he claims will help reduce Catherine's paranoid delusions and restore her ability to think clearly about important decisions. He explains that these medications are specifically designed to treat patients who experience paranoid thoughts about their family members and financial affairs, emphasizing that consistent compliance is essential to prevent her condition from deteriorating into complete psychotic breakdown. Catherine reluctantly agrees to take the prescribed medications, feeling frightened by Dr. Harrison's dire warnings about what could happen if her paranoid delusions are left untreated, while remaining completely unaware that these drugs are actually designed to cloud her thinking, increase her confusion, and make her more vulnerable to David's ongoing manipulation and financial theft. Catherine begins taking the psychiatric medications exactly as Dr. Harrison prescribed, while David carefully monitors her compliance to ensure she doesn't miss any doses that could interfere with their plan to keep her confused and dependent. The powerful pharmaceutical cocktail begins affecting Catherine's mental clarity within days, making her feel foggy, disoriented, and increasingly uncertain about her own thoughts and perceptions. When Catherine expresses concern about how the medications are making her feel worse rather than better, David reassures her that temporary side effects are normal and necessary for treating paranoid delusions, convincing her that her discomfort is actually evidence that the drugs are working to correct her distorted thinking patterns. Catherine calls her close friend Jennifer to discuss her worries about the medications and her growing suspicions that something isn't right about her situation, hoping to get advice from someone she trusts outside of her marriage. She explains her concerns about David's behavior and Dr. Harrison's diagnosis, describing how confused and frightened she feels about the rapid changes in her life since inheriting her parents' money. Jennifer listens with apparent concern, but her responses seem oddly unsympathetic as she suggests that Catherine should trust her husband and doctor rather than questioning their professional judgment, making Catherine feel even more isolated and confused about whether her instincts can be trusted when everyone around her seems to think she's losing her mind. Catherine meets her longtime friend Susan for dinner, desperately hoping to confide in someone about her fears that David and Dr. Harrison might be manipulating her situation for financial gain. When Catherine tries to explain her suspicions about her husband's motives and the suspicious timing of her supposed mental health crisis, Susan responds with gentle but firm concern about Catherine's paranoid thinking. Susan explains that David has already spoken with their mutual friends about Catherine's diagnosis and her tendency to develop conspiracy theories about the people trying to help her, making Catherine realize that David has been systematically poisoning her social relationships by convincing everyone that her legitimate concerns are actually symptoms of mental illness. Catherine attempts to reach out to another friend, Maria, hoping to find someone who will listen to her concerns without immediately dismissing them as paranoid delusions. When Catherine carefully explains her worries about David's sudden interest in controlling her finances and Dr. Harrison's rush diagnosis, Maria responds with obvious discomfort and suggests that Catherine should focus on taking her medication rather than developing elaborate theories about conspiracies. Maria mentions that David has been reaching out to their friend group to ask for support during Catherine's mental health crisis, making it clear that Catherine's entire social network has been systematically turned against her through David's careful manipulation and false narratives about her supposed psychological instability. Catherine sits alone in her living room feeling completely isolated and defeated after multiple failed attempts to get support from friends who have all been convinced that she's suffering from paranoid delusions about her husband's motives. The psychiatric medications have made her thinking increasingly foggy and uncertain, making it difficult for her to articulate her concerns coherently or remember specific details that might support her suspicions about David's behavior. David observes her growing despair with carefully concealed satisfaction, knowing that his systematic destruction of her social support network has left her completely dependent on him for emotional support and practical guidance, making it impossible for her to resist his plan to gain complete control over her inheritance and personal autonomy. Catherine lies awake at night, feeling completely alone and trapped in a nightmare that she can't escape or even properly understand due to the mental fog created by her psychiatric medications. Her friends have abandoned her. Her doctor insists she's mentally ill, and her husband appears to be the only person willing to support her through this crisis, even though her instincts tell her that something is fundamentally wrong with the entire situation. The isolation is complete as Catherine realizes that everyone in her life has been convinced that her legitimate concerns about financial manipulation are actually symptoms of paranoid delusions, leaving her completely powerless to protect herself from the systematic theft of her inheritance, while she becomes increasingly dependent on the very people who are destroying her life and stealing everything her parents worked to provide for her future security. David and Dr. Harrison meet secretly in Catherine's home office while she's upstairs resting, carefully reviewing their timeline for having her declared legally incompetent and committed to a psychiatric institution. Dr. Harrison shows David the comprehensive medical documentation he's been building, including detailed notes about Catherine's supposed paranoid delusions and inability to make rational financial decisions. They discuss the specific incidents they need to orchestrate to demonstrate Catherine's danger to herself, ensuring that their plan to gain complete control over her $15 million inheritance appears legitimate to courts and social workers who might question the need for emergency psychiatric intervention and financial guardianship. David deliberately creates a dangerous situation by leaving the gas stove burner on high, while Catherine is cooking in her medicated, confused state, then discovering the hazard and expressing dramatic concern about her safety to neighbors who can witness his alarm. He carefully documents this incident with photos and detailed written notes, describing how Catherine's mental deterioration has progressed to the point where she can no longer safely perform basic household tasks without constant supervision. When Catherine insists she didn't leave the burner on, David gently explains that her paranoid delusions are making it impossible for her to recognize her own dangerous behavior, creating manufactured evidence that will support their narrative about her urgent need for psychiatric intervention and financial protection. Catherine discovers financial documents hidden in David's desk drawer that reveal he's been secretly meeting with lawyers about guardianship proceedings and discussing her inheritance with financial advisors without her knowledge or consent. The documents include Dr. Harrison's preliminary reports recommending institutionalization and detailed financial assessments of her estate that David has commissioned for his own benefit. When David unexpectedly enters the room and finds Catherine reading these papers, he immediately claims that she's violating his privacy and exhibiting the exact kind of paranoid, suspicious behavior that Dr. Harrison warned him about, using her legitimate discovery of his conspiracy as further evidence of her mental instability rather than proof of his betrayal and fraud. David meets with Catherine's financial advisor to discuss assuming temporary control over her investment accounts due to her deteriorating mental health and recent dangerous incidents that demonstrate her inability to make sound financial decisions. He presents carefully edited medical documentation from Dr. Harrison and incident reports that portray Catherine as increasingly unstable and paranoid about her own family's attempts to help her manage her substantial inheritance responsibly. The financial advisor reluctantly agrees to process paperwork that will give David temporary oversight of Catherine's accounts, while formal guardianship proceedings move through the legal system, providing him with immediate access to portions of her $15 million inheritance under the guise of protecting her from her own impaired judgment. Catherine confronts David about the guardianship documents and financial meetings she discovered, demanding to know why he's been secretly planning to have her declared incompetent and gain control over her inheritance. She explains that despite the medication making her feel confused, She's beginning to understand that he's been systematically manipulating her situation to steal her parents' money through fraudulent medical diagnosis and legal proceedings. David responds with calm concern, suggesting that Catherine's accusations are exactly the kind of paranoid delusions that Dr. Harrison warned him about, and that her inability to trust the people trying to help her proves that she needs immediate psychiatric intervention before she becomes dangerous to herself or others who care about her well-being. Catherine attempts to call her family's longtime attorney to report David's scheme and seek legal protection for her inheritance, but discovers that David has already contacted the lawyer to explain Catherine's mental health crisis and paranoid accusations against her own husband. When Catherine tries to explain the conspiracy to steal her money, the attorney gently suggests that she should focus on getting the psychiatric help that Dr. Harrison has recommended rather than pursuing legal action based on what appear to be delusions about David's motives. Catherine realizes with growing horror that David has systematically poisoned her professional relationships, just as he did with her friends, leaving her completely isolated and unable to find anyone who will believe her legitimate concerns about financial fraud and manipulation. Catherine searches through David's personal belongings while he's out, discovering additional evidence of his long-term plan, including correspondence with Dr. Harrison for months before her supposed mental health crisis began. The documents reveal that David has been planning this scheme since shortly after her parents' death, researching methods for having wealthy spouses declared incompetent and identifying corrupt medical professionals willing to provide false diagnoses for financial compensation. Catherine realizes that her entire mental health crisis has been manufactured from the beginning, but also understands that the evidence she's found will be dismissed as products of her paranoid delusions, since everyone already believes she's mentally unstable and incapable of rational thought or accurate perception. Catherine attempts to call the police to report the financial fraud and conspiracy against her, but David prevents her from completing the call by gently taking the phone and explaining to the dispatcher that his wife is having a paranoid episode and needs medical attention rather than police intervention. The dispatcher expresses sympathy for David's difficult situation and recommends that he contact Catherine's psychiatrist immediately if she continues to make false accusations against her own family members. Catherine listens in despair as David successfully portrays her legitimate attempt to seek help as evidence of her mental illness, realizing that his manipulation has been so thorough that even law enforcement will dismiss her concerns as psychiatric symptoms rather than actual criminal activity that threatens her life and financial security. Catherine discovers that David has already begun restricting her access to her own financial accounts by convincing banks and investment firms that her mental condition makes her vulnerable to making dangerous financial decisions without proper supervision. When she tries to log into her online banking, she finds that her access has been limited and that David has been added as a temporary co-signer on her accounts due to medical necessity. Catherine realizes that despite her growing awareness of David's scheme, he has moved too quickly and systematically for her to prevent the theft of her inheritance, leaving her legally powerless to protect the $15 million that her parents intended to provide security for her future, while David gains increasing control over every aspect of her financial life. Catherine lies awake realizing the full scope of David's betrayal and her own powerless situation, understanding that he has successfully turned everyone against her while positioning himself as her devoted caregiver and financial protector. She knows that any attempt to expose his scheme will be dismissed as paranoid delusions, that her friends and professionals have all been convinced of her mental instability, and that David now has legal mechanisms in place to complete his theft of her inheritance while having her permanently institutionalized. As David sleeps peacefully beside her, completely confident in his success, Catherine understands that tomorrow he will likely take the final steps to have her committed to a psychiatric facility where she'll remain trapped and medicated while he enjoys the luxury lifestyle that her parents' $15 million can provide, leaving her utterly alone and defenseless against his calculated destruction of her life and freedom. Catherine is forcibly escorted to the ambulance by paramedics after David called emergency services claiming she was having a violent paranoid episode and threatening to harm herself with kitchen knives. She struggles against the restraints while desperately trying to explain to the paramedics that this is all an elaborate setup orchestrated by her husband to steal her inheritance. But her protests are dismissed as evidence of her mental instability and paranoid delusions. The neighbors watch from their windows as Catherine is loaded into the ambulance, while David plays the role of the heartbroken husband who has no choice but to seek emergency psychiatric intervention for his beloved wife's deteriorating mental condition. David signs the involuntary commitment papers with carefully orchestrated tears streaming down his face, telling the medical staff how difficult this decision has been for him and how much he loves Catherine despite her increasingly dangerous behavior. He provides Dr. Harrison's medical documentation and detailed accounts of Catherine's recent paranoid episodes, emphasizing that she's become a danger to herself and others while refusing to take her prescribed medications consistently. The hospital staff accepts David's authority as Catherine's concerned husband and Dr. Harrison's medical recommendations, processing the paperwork that will allow them to hold Catherine for extended psychiatric evaluation and treatment against her will, while David gains complete legal control over her personal and financial affairs. Catherine is dragged through the imposing entrance of Willowbrook Mental Institution while screaming that this is all an elaborate conspiracy to steal her $15 million inheritance from her deceased parents. The institutional staff dismisses her protests as typical paranoid delusions commonly seen in patients with severe psychiatric disorders, while her desperate pleas for someone to investigate David's financial motives are recorded as additional evidence of her mental instability. The massive steel doors close behind her with a final, echoing slam that symbolizes the complete loss of her freedom and autonomy, while David watches from his car in the parking lot with satisfaction, knowing that Catherine is now trapped in a system designed to keep her isolated and medicated while he enjoys unrestricted access to her stolen wealth. Catherine undergoes the dehumanizing intake process at Willowbrook Mental Institution, where staff members treat her like a dangerous psychiatric patient rather than a victim of financial fraud and manipulation. She's forced to surrender all personal belongings, undergo medical examinations, and answer detailed questions about her supposed paranoid delusions and violent tendencies as documented by David and Dr. Harrison. When Catherine tries to explain the conspiracy against her, the intake staff notes her persistent paranoid ideation and inability to accept reality of her mental illness in her official medical record, creating documentation that will be used to justify extended involuntary commitment and intensive pharmaceutical intervention designed to keep her compliant and confused. Catherine is escorted down the sterile institutional corridor wearing a hospital gown, passing steel doors and barred windows that emphasize the prison-like nature of her new environment. The orderlies explain the strict rules and daily schedule she must follow, including mandatory medication times, supervised meals, and limited communication with the outside world that must be approved by her legal guardian. Catherine realizes with growing horror that David now has complete control over every aspect of her life, including her medical treatment, communication privileges, and any possibility of release from this psychiatric facility, leaving her completely powerless to protect herself or expose the conspiracy that has stolen her inheritance and destroyed her freedom. Catherine sits alone in her small institutional room, surrounded by sparse furnishings and barred windows that remind her constantly of her imprisonment in this psychiatric facility. The room contains only a narrow bed, small desk, and basic bathroom facilities, with no personal belongings or comfort items allowed without approval from medical staff and her legal guardian. She stares at the institutional walls while trying to process the reality that she's been successfully framed as mentally ill by her own husband, who is now free to enjoy her $15 million inheritance while she remains trapped in a system designed to keep her isolated, medicated, and unable to seek help or expose the truth about David's elaborate financial fraud. Catherine sits in the institutional dining hall, surrounded by other psychiatric patients, eating bland institutional food while observing the heavily medicated and genuinely mentally ill individuals who share her captivity. She realizes that she's been placed among people who are truly sick, making it even more difficult for anyone to believe her claims about being the victim of a conspiracy rather than a legitimate psychiatric patient. The staff treats her with the same condescending attitude they use with all patients, assuming that her protests about financial fraud are simply manifestations of her documented paranoid delusions, while Catherine understands that her credibility has been completely destroyed by David's systematic manipulation of her medical and legal records. Dr. Harrison visits Catherine at the institution to adjust her medication regimen, prescribing even stronger psychiatric drugs that he claims are necessary to control her violent paranoid episodes and help her accept reality about her mental condition. He explains that her persistent accusations against David are evidence that her previous medications weren't strong enough to address her severe psychiatric symptoms, and that intensive pharmaceutical intervention is required to protect both Catherine and the medical staff from her potentially dangerous behavior. Catherine feels increasingly drowsy and confused as the new medications take effect, making it even more difficult for her to think clearly or articulate her concerns about the conspiracy, while Dr. Harrison documents her improved compliance and reduced agitation as evidence that the treatment is working effectively. While Catherine remains heavily sedated in the psychiatric institution, David meets with her financial advisors to complete the legal transfer of her entire $15 million inheritance into accounts under his complete control as her legal guardian. He presents the court-ordered guardianship documents and medical certification of Catherine's mental incompetence, explaining that he's reluctantly accepting the burden of managing her complex financial portfolio while she receives long-term psychiatric treatment. The financial advisors process the paperwork that gives David unrestricted access to Catherine's inheritance, including her parents' real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and liquid assets, while expressing sympathy for his difficult situation and praising his dedication to protecting Catherine's financial interests during her mental health crisis. Catherine lies on her narrow institutional bed, heavily medicated and barely able to stay awake as the powerful psychiatric drugs cloud her thinking and suppress her ability to resist the system that's holding her captive. She realizes that David has successfully executed his plan to steal her inheritance while having her permanently removed from society, leaving her trapped in a psychiatric facility where her protests will always be dismissed as symptoms of mental illness rather than legitimate claims about financial fraud. As the medications pull her into unconsciousness, Catherine understands that she may never escape from this nightmare that David has created. While he enjoys the luxury lifestyle that her parents' $15 million can provide, having successfully destroyed her life, stolen her inheritance, and condemned her to indefinite imprisonment in a psychiatric institution where no one will ever believe her story about the conspiracy that destroyed everything. Catherine sits alone in the institutional dining hall, picking at her breakfast while feeling completely hopeless about her situation, when Linda, a compassionate nurse with warm brown eyes, approaches her table with genuine concern. Unlike the other staff members who treat Catherine with clinical detachment, Linda seems to notice something different about her compared to the other patients, observing that Catherine's behavior doesn't match the violent paranoid profile described in her medical records. Linda sits down beside Catherine and gently asks how she's feeling, speaking to her with respect and kindness rather than the condescending tone that most staff members use when addressing psychiatric patients, making Catherine feel like a human being for the first time since her imprisonment began. During a supervised walk through the institution corridors, Linda engages Catherine in careful conversation about her background and the circumstances that led to her commitment, listening attentively to Catherine's account of David's conspiracy without immediately dismissing her claims as paranoid delusions. Linda notices inconsistencies between Catherine's articulate explanations and the chaotic, violent behavior described in her official medical records, particularly noting that Catherine shows no signs of the aggressive tendencies that supposedly necessitated her emergency commitment. As they walk past other heavily medicated patients, Linda begins to suspect that Catherine might be telling the truth about being the victim of an elaborate scheme rather than a genuinely mentally ill person who requires psychiatric intervention. Linda stays after her shift to review Catherine's medical files and admission paperwork, discovering disturbing patterns in the documentation provided by David and Dr. Harrison that raise serious questions about the legitimacy of Catherine's commitment. She notices that Catherine's supposed history of violent behavior and paranoid delusions appears to have emerged suddenly after inheriting a substantial fortune, with no prior psychiatric history or warning signs that would typically precede such a severe mental health crisis. Linda also observes that Dr. Harrison's notes contain inconsistencies in medical terminology that doesn't match standard psychiatric evaluation procedures, making her increasingly suspicious that Catherine's commitment might be based on fraudulent medical documentation designed to facilitate financial exploitation rather than genuine mental health concerns. Linda uses her computer access to research Dr. Harrison's background and discovers a disturbing pattern of wealthy female patients who have been committed to various psychiatric facilities under similar circumstances involving sudden mental health crises after inheriting substantial money. She finds news articles and court records describing several cases where women with significant inheritances were declared mentally incompetent by Dr. Harrison, with their husbands or male relatives gaining legal guardianship and financial control over their estates. Linda realizes that Catherine appears to be the latest victim in what seems to be a systematic scheme involving fraudulent psychiatric diagnoses designed to facilitate the theft of wealthy women's inheritances through legal manipulation of the mental health and guardianship systems. Linda quietly enters Catherine's room during the night shift when other staff members are busy elsewhere, whispering that she believes Catherine's story about being the victim of a conspiracy and wants to help her expose David's scheme. She explains that her research has uncovered evidence of Dr. Harrison's involvement in similar cases involving wealthy women who were fraudulently committed to psychiatric facilities while their husbands or relatives gained control over their inheritances. Catherine feels overwhelming relief and gratitude that someone finally believes her and understands the truth about her situation, while Linda emphasizes that they must be extremely careful because exposing this conspiracy could put both of their lives in danger if David and Dr. Harrison realize that their scheme has been discovered. Linda helps Catherine access the medical records room during a shift change when security is minimal, where they discover files belonging to other wealthy women who were committed under suspicious circumstances similar to Catherine's case. They find documentation showing that several previous patients died mysteriously while under Dr. Harrison's care, with their estates being transferred to male relatives who had gained legal guardianship through fraudulent psychiatric evaluations. Catherine realizes with horror that David's plan may include ensuring that she never leaves the institution alive, making her death appear to be the result of her severe mental illness rather than murder designed to permanently secure his control over her $15 million inheritance. Linda shows Catherine the most shocking discovery of all: medical records indicating that David's first wife, Margaret, was also committed to this same psychiatric institution 10 years ago under nearly identical circumstances involving sudden mental health crisis after inheriting family money. The records show that Margaret died in the institution from what was officially ruled a suicide, but the documentation contains suspicious inconsistencies and gaps that suggest her death may have been orchestrated rather than self-inflicted. Catherine realizes that she was never David's first victim, and that he has successfully executed this elaborate scheme before, using the same corrupt medical professionals and legal procedures to steal his previous wife's inheritance, while eliminating any possibility that she could expose his crimes or reclaim her stolen wealth. Linda and Catherine carefully plan their escape from the institution while avoiding security cameras and night shift staff who might report their suspicious behavior to Dr. Harrison or David. Linda explains that she has access to keys and security codes that will allow them to leave the building during the early morning shift change, when staffing is minimal and security protocols are temporarily relaxed. They discuss their strategy for gathering additional evidence of the conspiracy once they escape, including contacting law enforcement officials who aren't already influenced by David's manipulation and finding attorneys who can help Catherine reclaim her inheritance, while exposing the criminal network that has been systematically targeting wealthy women through fraudulent psychiatric commitments and financial exploitation. Catherine and Linda successfully escaped from Willowbrook Mental Institution through a service entrance during the early morning shift change, carrying copies of the medical records and documentation that prove David's conspiracy and Dr. Harrison's involvement in multiple cases of financial fraud through false psychiatric diagnoses. They move quickly but carefully toward Linda's car parked in a nearby lot, knowing that they have only a few hours before their absence is discovered and David is notified that his carefully constructed plan has been exposed. Catherine feels a mixture of terror and hope as she breathes free air for the first time in weeks, understanding that her escape is only the beginning of a dangerous battle to expose the conspiracy, reclaim her inheritance, and ensure that David and his accomplices face justice for their crimes against her and other innocent victims. As Linda drives them away from the institution towards safety, Catherine reflects on how discovering the truth about David's first wife has completely changed her understanding of the conspiracy against her and provided the key evidence needed to expose his crimes. She realizes that Linda's courage and investigative skills have not only saved her life, but also given her the tools necessary to fight back against the elaborate scheme that nearly destroyed her completely. Linda emphasizes that they must move quickly to contact law enforcement and legal professionals before David realizes that his plan has been discovered and attempts to silence them permanently. While Catherine feels grateful that her nightmare in the psychiatric institution has led to finding the evidence and ally she needs to reclaim her inheritance, expose the conspiracy, and ensure that David faces consequences for his systematic destruction of innocent women's lives and theft of their family wealth. Linda helps Catherine escape from Willowbrook Mental Institution during the early morning shift change, when security is minimal and most staff members are distracted by the transition between night and day crews. They move carefully through the corridors, avoiding security cameras and using Linda's knowledge of institutional procedures to navigate past locked doors and security checkpoints without triggering alarms. Catherine feels her heart pounding as they approach the service exit, knowing that discovery would mean immediate return to psychiatric custody and possibly worse consequences for Linda, who is risking her career and freedom to help expose the conspiracy. The timing is critical, as they have only a narrow window between shifts when their absence might go unnoticed long enough to escape the building and reach safety before David is alerted to Catherine's disappearance. Linda and Catherine successfully reach Linda's car in the institution parking lot, carrying stolen files and evidence that Linda has been secretly collecting about David's conspiracy and Dr. Harrison's fraudulent medical practices over the past several weeks. The evidence includes medical records of other wealthy female patients who died under suspicious circumstances, financial documents showing unusual patterns in guardianship cases, and detailed notes about irregularities in psychiatric evaluations that facilitated inheritance theft. Catherine feels overwhelming relief as they drive away from the institution, but also understands that their escape is only the beginning of a dangerous race against time to expose the conspiracy before David realizes she's missing and takes steps to silence them permanently, or have her returned to psychiatric custody through additional false medical claims about her dangerous mental state. Linda takes Catherine to a safe location where they begin the dangerous task of collecting additional evidence, including setting up recording equipment to capture secret conversations between David and Dr. Harrison about their ongoing conspiracy and plans for Catherine's permanent elimination. Linda has discovered that David and Dr. Harrison meet regularly at a private office to coordinate their criminal activities, providing an opportunity to record incriminating conversations that will prove their guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Catherine feels terrified but determined as they prepare the surveillance operation, knowing that obtaining these recordings is essential to exposing the conspiracy, but also understanding that discovery could result in their immediate murder if David realizes they're gathering evidence of his crimes against multiple wealthy women over many years. Catherine and Linda successfully record a secret meeting between David and Dr. Harrison where they discuss their plans for permanently disposing of Catherine and identifying their next wealthy female target for the inheritance theft scheme. The recorded conversation includes shocking details about how they murdered David's first wife, Margaret, and made her death appear to be suicide. along with plans for causing Catherine's death through accidental medication overdose that will eliminate any possibility of her exposing their crimes. Linda operates the recording equipment while Catherine listens in horror to David's casual discussion of murdering her. Finally understanding the full scope of his evil and the systematic nature of his crimes against vulnerable women who trusted him with their lives and financial security. While David is at the institution checking on Catherine's supposed condition, Linda and Catherine break into his home office to collect fraudulent financial documents that prove his theft of Catherine's inheritance and systematic embezzlement from other victims' estates over many years. They photograph bank statements, investment records, and legal documents that show David's unauthorized access to multiple women's inheritances through fraudulent guardianship arrangements facilitated by Dr. Harrison's false psychiatric diagnoses. Catherine feels sick as she discovers evidence that David has stolen millions of dollars from at least 6 different wealthy women, using the same pattern of false mental health crises followed by institutional commitment and mysterious deaths that eliminate any witnesses to his crimes while providing him with complete financial control over their estates. Linda uses her medical credentials to access Dr. Harrison's private office, where they collect evidence of his systematic medical fraud, including blank psychiatric evaluation forms, forged medical records, and correspondence with David about their conspiracy to defraud wealthy female patients. They discover a filing cabinet containing detailed profiles of potential victims that Dr. Harrison has identified based on their inheritance status and social isolation, revealing the calculated nature of their scheme to target vulnerable women who lack strong family support systems. Catherine feels horrified as she realizes how methodically David and Dr. Harrison have been identifying and destroying innocent women's lives for financial gain. While Linda photographs the evidence that will prove their guilt and help identify other potential victims who might still be saved from similar exploitation. Catherine and Linda work frantically through the night to organize all the evidence they've collected, including the secret recordings, financial documents, medical fraud proof, and historical records of David's first wife Margaret's suspicious death at the same institution. They create comprehensive evidence packages for law enforcement, media outlets, and legal authorities while constantly checking for signs that David has discovered Catherine's escape and begun searching for them. The race against time intensifies as they realize David will likely check on Catherine at the institution within hours, and once he discovers her absence, he'll immediately begin damage control that could include destroying evidence, fleeing the country, or attempting to murder them before they can expose his crimes to authorities who have the power to stop him and bring justice for all his victims. Back at Willowbrook Mental Institution, the morning staff discovers Catherine's empty room during routine medication rounds, immediately triggering institutional security protocols and notification procedures that will alert David to her escape within minutes. The orderlies search the building while administrators review security footage and contact Dr. Harrison about the missing patient who was supposedly dangerous and required constant supervision. Catherine's escape sends shockwaves through the institution as staff members realize that a supposedly violent psychiatric patient has disappeared without triggering any alarms, raising questions about security procedures and the accuracy of her medical diagnosis that will eventually contribute to exposing the broader conspiracy involving fraudulent commitments and financial exploitation of vulnerable patients. David receives the devastating phone call informing him that Catherine has escaped from the psychiatric institution, immediately realizing that his carefully constructed conspiracy is now in serious jeopardy if she reaches law enforcement or media outlets with evidence of his crimes. His shock quickly turns to rage as he understands that someone must have helped Catherine escape, and that she likely has access to information that could expose his entire scheme and lead to criminal prosecution for fraud, theft, and multiple murders disguised as psychiatric patient suicides. David begins implementing emergency damage control procedures, including destroying evidence, transferring stolen money to offshore accounts, and planning to flee the country before Catherine can present her case to authorities who might believe her accusations against him and Dr. Harrison. Catherine and Linda complete their evidence compilation just as they learn that David has been notified of the escape, understanding that they now have only hours before he attempts to destroy evidence or silence them permanently to protect his criminal enterprise. They prepare comprehensive evidence packages containing recordings, financial documents, medical fraud proof, and historical information about previous victims, ready to simultaneously contact multiple law enforcement agencies and media outlets to ensure the conspiracy is exposed even if David attempts to stop them. Catherine feels a mixture of terror and determination as they prepare to make the phone calls that will either bring justice for her and the other victims or result in their deaths if David discovers their location before authorities can protect them, and begin the criminal prosecution that will finally end his systematic exploitation and murder of wealthy women through fraudulent psychiatric commitment and inheritance theft. Catherine and Linda rush into the police station carrying boxes of evidence just hours after David discovered Catherine's escape, knowing they have limited time before he attempts to flee the country or destroy remaining proof of his crimes. They demand to speak with Detective Martinez immediately, explaining that they have comprehensive evidence of a conspiracy involving financial fraud, medical malpractice, and multiple murders disguised as psychiatric patient suicides over many years. The desk sergeant initially treats them with skepticism, especially when he learns that Catherine is technically an escaped psychiatric patient, but Linda's credentials as a medical professional and their organized evidence presentation convince him to contact Detective Martinez urgently. Catherine feels desperate as precious minutes tick away, knowing that David is likely destroying evidence and preparing to disappear while they wait for someone in authority to take their accusations seriously enough to begin immediate action. Detective Martinez arrives within minutes and immediately begins reviewing the evidence that Catherine and Linda have collected, his expression becoming increasingly grave as he examines the recorded conversations, financial documents, and medical fraud proof that reveal the scope of David's criminal enterprise. The detective listens to the shocking audio recordings where David and Dr. Harrison casually discuss murdering Catherine and planning their next victim, understanding that this evidence provides irrefutable proof of conspiracy to commit murder and systematic financial fraud. Catherine and Linda provide detailed explanations of how they discovered the pattern of wealthy women being fraudulently committed to psychiatric institutions before dying under suspicious circumstances, while Detective Martinez coordinates with other law enforcement agencies to begin immediate arrest warrants and evidence preservation procedures before David can escape or destroy additional proof of his crimes. Detective Martinez coordinates with FBI, financial crimes units, medical licensing boards, and district attorney's office to organize a comprehensive law enforcement response that will simultaneously arrest David and Dr. Harrison while securing all evidence before they can destroy proof or flee the jurisdiction. The multi-agency task force reviews Catherine and Linda's evidence while preparing search warrants for multiple locations, including David's home, Dr. Harrison's medical offices, and Willowbrook Mental Institution, where additional victims may still be held under fraudulent psychiatric commitments. Law enforcement officials express shock at the systematic nature of the conspiracy and the number of wealthy women who have been victimized through this elaborate scheme involving medical fraud and legal manipulation designed to facilitate inheritance theft and murder. The urgency intensifies as investigators realize that David likely has escape plans and offshore financial accounts that will make apprehension impossible if he successfully flees the country before arrests can be executed. David works frantically in his luxury apartment to destroy evidence and pack stolen cash and jewelry before law enforcement can arrive, his calm facade completely shattered by the realization that Catherine's escape has exposed his entire criminal operation. He burns financial documents in his fireplace while transferring remaining stolen funds to offshore accounts, knowing that his carefully constructed life of luxury purchased with murdered women's inheritances is about to collapse permanently. David's desperation increases as he realizes that the recorded conversations and evidence Catherine collected will make conviction inevitable, leaving him with no option except immediate flight to a country without extradition treaties if he hopes to avoid life imprisonment or execution for his crimes. His hands shake as he stuffs millions of dollars in stolen cash into suitcases, understanding that his elaborate scheme has been completely exposed and that his victims have finally found a way to achieve justice from beyond their graves. Multiple police units with sirens blazing race toward David's apartment, Dr. Harrison's medical office, and Willowbrook Mental Institution in a coordinated law enforcement response designed to arrest both conspirators and secure all evidence before they can destroy proof or harm additional victims. The FBI Financial Crimes Team heads toward banks and investment firms to freeze David's accounts and recover stolen inheritance money, while medical investigators prepare to examine Dr. Harrison's patient records and identify other potential victims who may still be alive but trapped in fraudulent psychiatric commitments. Detective Martinez leads the team approaching David's apartment, knowing that timing is critical since David has likely been destroying evidence and preparing to flee ever since he learned about Catherine's escape hours earlier. The coordinated response represents the culmination of Catherine and Linda's dangerous investigation and their successful exposure of a conspiracy that has systematically murdered wealthy women for financial gain over many years. Police units surround David's luxury apartment building just as he attempts to escape through the back service entrance, carrying suitcases full of stolen cash and jewelry purchased with his victims' inheritance money. David's shock and panic are evident as he realizes that law enforcement has moved faster than he anticipated, leaving him no time to complete his escape plans or destroy all the incriminating evidence that will prove his guilt in multiple murders and financial fraud cases. Detective Martinez and his team apprehend David in the parking garage as he tries to reach a getaway vehicle, finding him in possession of millions of dollars in stolen assets and detailed plans for fleeing to countries without extradition agreements with the United States. David's arrest marks the beginning of justice for Catherine and the other women whose lives he destroyed through his elaborate conspiracy involving fraudulent medical diagnosis and systematic inheritance theft disguised as legitimate psychiatric care and financial guardianship. While David is being arrested at his apartment, another team of investigators simultaneously raids Dr. Harrison's medical office, discovering extensive evidence of systematic medical fraud, including blank psychiatric evaluation forms, forged patient records, and detailed profiles of wealthy women targeted for the inheritance theft scheme. Medical licensing investigators work with law enforcement to secure patient files that reveal Dr. Harrison's pattern of fraudulent diagnoses designed to facilitate psychiatric commitments and financial guardianship transfers that enabled systematic theft and murder over many years. The evidence includes correspondence with David about identifying potential victims and coordinating their scheme to exploit vulnerable wealthy women through manipulation of the medical and legal systems designed to protect rather than victimize patients seeking legitimate mental health care. Dr. Harrison's arrest and the seizure of his fraudulent medical records provide additional proof of the conspiracy while helping investigators identify other potential victims who may still be alive but trapped in psychiatric institutions under false diagnoses. Law enforcement and medical investigators conduct an emergency examination of Willowbrook Mental Institution, reviewing patient records and treatment procedures to identify other wealthy women who may have been fraudulently committed as part of David and Dr. Harrison's systematic inheritance theft scheme. The investigation reveals shocking irregularities in admission procedures, medication protocols, and patient deaths that occurred under suspicious circumstances over the past several years, providing evidence that the institution itself may have been complicit in the conspiracy or at minimum negligent in its oversight of Dr. Harrison's fraudulent medical practices. Investigators interview current patients and staff members while examining financial records that show unusual patterns in guardianship cases and inheritance transfers that coincided with psychiatric commitments and subsequent patient deaths. The institutional investigation expands the scope of the criminal case while providing hope that other victims may still be saved and that systematic reforms can prevent similar exploitation of vulnerable individuals through corruption of medical and legal systems designed to provide protection rather than facilitate abuse. Catherine provides comprehensive testimony to Detective Martinez and prosecutors, describing every detail of David's systematic manipulation, Dr. Harrison's fraudulent medical treatment, and the conspiracy that nearly cost her life while stealing her $15 million inheritance from her deceased parents. Her testimony includes specific accounts of the psychological manipulation tactics David used to isolate her from friends and family, the false medical symptoms that Dr. Harrison documented to justify her psychiatric commitment, and the evidence she and Linda discovered proving that David had previously murdered his first wife, Margaret, using identical methods. Catherine's detailed statement provides prosecutors with the foundation for criminal charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, medical malpractice, and systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals through corruption of medical and legal institutions designed to provide protection and care rather than facilitate theft and violence against innocent victims seeking legitimate help. Prosecutors present their comprehensive case against David and Dr. Harrison to a judge who will determine bail and preliminary charges, including the recorded conversations, financial evidence, medical fraud documentation, and historical pattern of suspicious deaths among wealthy female patients under their care. The judge expresses shock at the systematic nature of the conspiracy and a number of victims who were murdered through fraudulent psychiatric commitment and inheritance theft disguised as legitimate medical treatment and financial guardianship designed to protect vulnerable individuals. Catherine sits in the courtroom feeling vindicated as the truth about David's elaborate scheme is finally exposed to legal authorities who have the power to ensure justice for her and the other women whose lives were destroyed by this criminal conspiracy. The judge denies bail for both David and Dr. Harrison due to flight risk and the serious nature of their crimes, while ordering comprehensive asset seizure to recover stolen inheritance money and ensure that victim compensation can be provided through restitution proceedings that will restore financial security to survivors and families of those who were murdered for their wealth. The courtroom is packed with media and victim advocates as the judge delivers the final verdict in David's criminal trial for conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and systematic exploitation of vulnerable women. David sits defeated in prison clothing as the judge reads the comprehensive list of charges for which he has been found guilty beyond reasonable doubt. The evidence, including recorded conversations, financial documents, and Catherine's testimony, has painted a clear picture of his elaborate criminal enterprise that targeted wealthy women for inheritance theft through murder disguised as psychiatric patient suicide. The judge announces David's sentence of 25 years to life in federal prison without possibility of parole, ensuring he will never again victimize innocent women seeking love and companionship. Catherine stands on the courthouse steps addressing media representatives, victim advocates, and supporters who have gathered to hear her statement about achieving justice for herself and other women destroyed by David's conspiracy. She speaks with confidence about her ordeal, describing how David's systematic manipulation nearly cost her life and fortune while emphasizing the importance of reforming psychiatric commitment procedures to prevent similar exploitation. Catherine's public statement serves as both celebration of justice and warning to potential victims about sophisticated methods predators use to target wealthy individuals through manipulation of medical and legal systems. Her courage in speaking publicly helps raise awareness about inheritance fraud and the need for stronger safeguards to protect people from elaborate schemes involving false medical diagnoses. Catherine meets with her financial advisors to review recovery of her stolen inheritance and restoration of complete financial control after months of legal proceedings to trace and recover assets David had transferred to hidden accounts. The financial team presents detailed reports showing prosecutors and federal investigators have successfully recovered nearly $14 million of her original $15 million inheritance, with remaining funds recoverable through ongoing asset seizure and restitution payments from David's conviction. Catherine feels tremendous relief signing documents that restore her complete authority over her parents' legacy while establishing new security measures to protect her from future exploitation attempts. The financial recovery represents not only restoration of her economic security, but validation that justice can prevail against sophisticated criminal schemes designed to steal from vulnerable individuals. Dr. Harrison faces the state medical licensing board for final disciplinary proceedings that will permanently revoke his medical license and bar him from ever practicing medicine due to systematic abuse of medical authority for criminal purposes. The panel reviews evidence of his fraudulent psychiatric diagnoses, improper medication protocols, and conspiracy to facilitate murder through false medical documentation that enabled David's inheritance theft scheme. Dr. Harrison's medical career ends in disgrace as board members express outrage at his betrayal of the Hippocratic Oath and damage to public trust in psychiatric medicine. The license revocation ensures Dr. Harrison can never again use medical authority to exploit vulnerable patients while serving as warning to other medical professionals about serious consequences of participating in criminal schemes. Catherine and Linda work together in their new foundation office, reviewing architectural plans for a comprehensive victim advocacy center that will provide legal assistance, counseling services, and financial protection resources for individuals targeted for inheritance fraud through false medical diagnoses. The foundation represents Catherine's commitment to transforming her traumatic experience in a positive change that will protect other vulnerable people while providing support for survivors rebuilding their lives after victimization. Linda serves as Director of Medical Advocacy, using her nursing background and investigative experience to develop training programs for healthcare professionals about recognizing suspicious psychiatric commitment procedures. Their partnership has evolved from Life-Saving Alliance into a powerful advocacy organization addressing systemic vulnerabilities in medical and legal institutions while providing hope and practical assistance to survivors. Catherine provides expert testimony before state legislators about urgent need for reforms to psychiatric commitment procedures and guardianship laws that will prevent future exploitation through fraudulent medical diagnoses and legal manipulation. Her testimony draws on personal experience and foundation research to propose specific legislative changes, including mandatory independent medical evaluations, enhanced oversight of guardianship proceedings, and stronger penalties for healthcare professionals who abuse their authority. The lawmakers listen with concern as Catherine describes how easily current systems can be manipulated by criminals, while emphasizing that proper reforms can maintain protections for genuinely mentally ill individuals. Catherine's advocacy represents her transformation from victim to powerful voice for systemic change that honors other victims' memory while protecting future generations from similar exploitation. Catherine visits a beautiful memorial garden her foundation created to honor Margaret and other women who died as victims of David's conspiracy before they could escape or seek justice. She places fresh flowers at a memorial stone inscribed with known victims' names while reflecting on how their tragic deaths ultimately provided evidence needed to expose David's schemes and prevent future victimizations. The memorial garden serves as both remembrance place for those who lost their lives and symbol of hope for survivors who found strength to rebuild after experiencing betrayal and exploitation. Catherine's regular visits remind her of the responsibility she feels to honor these women's memories through continued advocacy work and commitment to ensuring their deaths became foundation for positive changes protecting other vulnerable individuals. Catherine and Linda host a support group meeting for other survivors of inheritance fraud and financial exploitation, providing safe space for individuals to share experiences and access resources for legal assistance and emotional healing. The Foundation's Victim Services Program has grown to serve dozens of survivors who experienced various forms of financial abuse while working to identify and assist individuals currently trapped in situations similar to Catherine's psychiatric imprisonment. The support group represents the heart of Catherine's mission to transform her traumatic experience into strength and healing for others who survived similar betrayals by trusted partners or medical professionals who exploited their vulnerability. Linda facilitates meetings using her medical background and experience, helping Catherine escape to provide practical guidance and emotional support for individuals rebuilding their lives after systematic manipulation. Catherine addresses medical students about ethical responsibilities of healthcare professionals and importance of recognizing suspicious patterns that might indicate patient exploitation or fraud within medical institutions. Her presentation combines personal experience with foundation research to educate future doctors, nurses, and mental health professionals about warning signs of systematic abuse and procedures they should follow to protect vulnerable patients. The medical students listen intently as Catherine describes how Dr. Harrison's abuse of medical authority facilitated David's criminal scheme, while emphasizing that healthcare professionals have ethical and legal obligations to protect patients from harm. Catherine's educational outreach ensures the next generation of medical professionals will be better prepared to recognize and prevent similar abuses while maintaining trust and integrity essential to effective healthcare relationships. Catherine sits in her foundation office, surrounded by thank you letters from survivors, legal victory notifications, and photographs from memorial services, reflecting on her journey from victim to advocate that has defined her life since escaping David's conspiracy. She speaks directly to viewers about the importance of trusting their instincts when something feels wrong, encouraging them to share where they're watching from and what they thought of this incredible story of survival and justice. Catherine asks viewers to like the video if this story inspired them. Subscribe for more amazing tales of courage overcoming adversity. And remember that no matter how dark things seem, there's always hope for justice and healing when good people stand together to fight against those who would exploit and harm the innocent.